Hey, Joe Slay, great to see you. Hey, we're finally going to get a chance to do this thing we've been talking about, walk through the museum, huh?
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, oh, you know, I've heard a lot of stories over the years about all these different airplanes, and now we're going to see them and let you talk about them. I'm looking forward to it.
I hope you're not disappointed.
I won't be. It's great to be here at I call the Air Force Museum, but now it's the National Air Force Museum. And a beautiful place.
Oh, changed the name, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. I just have a few things that I wanted to say. Number one, we're passing a lot of airplanes that I have some knowledge of. A lot of them I know well, but some of them I know very slightly. And I want to make sure that those 200-hour airplanes that are on your list that I flew, not all of those can I claim expertise in. And I didn't want to fly under a false banner here that I'm an expert in all these airplanes. I'm an expert in some of them, but there are more that I'm not an expert in than there are that I'm an expert in. Now that goes against you know what an officer effectiveness report is? My first officer effectiveness report as a second lieutenant was by a squadron commander, a name of John L. Hartranft. And he wound up with the FAA. He's gone a long time now, but this was back in 1944. And he wrote my OER that Second Lieutenant Slay is, in my opinion, the best pilot in my squadron, period. Unfortunately, he thinks so too. Grew up in Crystal Springs, and I spent all of my youth in Crystal Springs. This was in the middle of the Depression, by the way, when I was growing up, and all kids worked. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I was going to have to earn my living, and I did. But I would not have changed it for anything. We didn't have two nickels to rub together, but everything we had needed to eat, we grew on the farm, everything. And the only two things we had to trade for, we didn't buy, was salt and flour. Everything else, including sugar, we made on the farm. Gene and I went to the same high school, and I'm the only person in history to have wrecked an ice wagon with a full load of 6 300-pound blocks of ice in it. But I did. But when I started going with her, my assistant, who was, what was his name? Sonny? Alford. Sonny Alford. He and I were driving along in our ice truck and passed his house, and here were Jean and her twin sister out there twirling their batons. So we pulled to a screeching halt. Jean and Jane came out, and one said, "What do you want?" Smiling, and I said, "A date." So that's how we started. And she's been stuck with me ever since. Right, Jean? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I won't bore you again with the story of that one, but that was the only time I flew it was when I was in basic flying training at Malden Army Airfield in Missouri. In basic, it was a little bit different. I was gotten a little bit sharp around the edges, I guess, and decided I wanted to do things. So on my first cross-country trip in a VT-13, it was from Malden to Cape Girardeau to somewhere over in Illinois, and back down to Cairo, Illinois, and then back to Malden. Well, as I passed Cairo, I had just passed a bridge that went over the Ohio River. And I said, great Scots, to myself, that is just waiting for me. So I decided that I would go around and fly under it, which I did. And then I said, well, that was so much fun, I'm going to do a loop. So I went under it, and this is a guy with 100 flying hours. And I flew under the bridge as fast as a VT-13 would go, and then pulled up, and this was really, I'd only done maybe 2 or 3 loops total. And I did a loop around the bridge, stalled out on top, and managed to get back down and went under the bridge again. And there was an instructor from Malden that had been on the bridge and observed this. So I thought I was, when I was hailed into the squadron commander's office, I thought I was in trouble, but it really wasn't. This instructor that had been on the bridge and saw it told me that, I had done that all wrong. I'd put too much G-force on it when I pulled up, and that's what caused me to lose all my speed. Well, I dodged that bullet. That wasn't the first one, and it certainly wasn't the last. I spent most of my career dodging bullets of one type or another. But I flew the AT-6 a lot. One of these days, when you have enough time, I'll tell you about when I was in latter stages of flying cadets in these. My instructor was showing off one day, and he wanted to show me how to do an inverted Elman in an AT-6. And he got about, that is, you go down here, you roll over and you push up and go over inverted Elman, so that when you get up on top, your head's not down, it's up. But he got about up to here, and I didn't hear anything. And so I took over because we were just about stalled. And he called in, and he was very nervous, obviously, and said, take us in somewhere and land. But I was still a flying cadet. I was a cadet. I had not graduated. I was just still in cadets. And we had this was in Alabama, and we had a little strip down on the Alabama River that I saw, and it was used for us to shoot landings. So I dived down, and he when he finally got his intercom working, he told me that to go in and land as quickly as I could. So I made a screaming dive down toward Furnace Field, was the name of the little field. And I was high, and in those days, Air Training Command required that both canopies be open for both takeoff and landing. And so I opened my canopy, and he evidently opened his in the back. And I was coming in high, but I didn't want to go around because he was sounded, he had to get on around right away. So I put it in a side slip to lose altitude. And I really, people say you couldn't have heard it, but I heard the screech. My instructor pilot was almost thrown out of the airplane by me skidding the airplane on final approach to lose altitude. And we had a mirror up here, and I looked in the mirror, and there was this much of him up above the canopy. On the BC-1 and the AT-6 that we had, a lot of them were the same. You could turn the seat 180 degrees around, that they could practice gunnery.
Yeah.
the guy in the back seat. Anyhow, what had happened is somebody had had the seat out and had forgot to put the pin in. And when he was like that at negative G's, he wound up on his back in top of the canopy.
Wow.
Crazy.
He was glad to get on the ground, I bet, huh?
He was, but he said, if I wasn't so glad to get on the ground, Slay, I would kill you. That Gene ever flew with me in anything was in an 86 at Craig Field. In those days, pilots could, if they were flying an airplane that had more than one seat in it, take their wives up twice a year. That was authorized, and almost everybody did it. So this was my first time, and I was a young second lieutenant, and Jean thought that was the greatest thing in the world. So we went out, and we fixed her up with a flying suit, and we went out to the airplane, and the crew chief, who looked like he was about 12 years old, took off his cap and gave his cap to Jean and said, Miss Slay, in case you get sick, you can throw up in my cap. And Jean said, well, I won't need that. I said, well, you take it along anyhow. Well, so we strapped Jean in, and I got in, started the airplane up, and we took off. And I went up and took her on a little sightseeing tour of the Craig Field area and down on the river and around. Then we climbed up a bit, and I said, Jean, would you like a little turns and acrobatics? He said, yes, I would. So first of all, I did some turns, and then she said, well, I thought you were going to do some acrobatics. So I did a few rolls, and I did a loop, and I did an Immelman, and I did a lot of things, and she was just having a ball back there. She thought that was the greatest thing in the world. So Jean already had been briefed. She had to open her canopy and knew how to do it. The Air Training Command in those days, as I've said before, required both cockpits to have the canopy open. So we went in, and she had her canopy open, and we landed and taxied back in, and this young 12-year-old crew chief, he had to be 18, but he looked 12. And when he came up to help Jean out of the airplane, she gave him his hat back. And he's grinned from ear to ear, says, you didn't use it. Well, this was my first fighter. As a matter of fact, that has to be an N, which is what I flew, the P-40N. But nobody told me how to taxi. And I didn't realize how far that nose stuck out, and you couldn't see taxiing, so you had to do S-turns to see where you were going. And then when you got up and you say you're flying slowly, if you were making a, say, square pattern to get back into land, you were constantly going up and down, pushing the nose down so you could see, and you had to compensate for that.
Just to be able to see.
Yeah. First long cross-country in the P-40 was I was going to circumnavigate the United States from Friday through Sunday night. And that's a long way to go in a P-40. And the P-40N, which I was flying, all the flight instrument says was needle ball and airspeed. That's it. Had no artificial horizon, and nothing like that. And it had a 4-button VHF radio. That's it. Anyhow, I took off from, can't remember where it was, up in the northeast somewhere. And I was going across country. And I stopped at what turned out to be later Scott Field in Illinois. And my next stop was Cheyenne, Wyoming. So I took off from Scott, and it was a huge front. And I kept going south and south, and I couldn't, because I'd never flown a P-40 on instruments. I didn't have anything but needle ball and airspeed anyhow. It was at night, about 2 o'clock at night. Well, at any rate, I trying to dodge thunderstorms at night and going up and down and up and down. I got totally lost. I didn't have a clue who we were. Back in those days, and I don't know if you're too young to remember this, all airline, there was every pathway that the airlines flew had lights, rotating beacons. And they had two kinds of nav aids, well, one kind of nav aid really, which was what's called a range, which you had to, it was just transmitted, and you would get in one segment you'd get a dit-da, in the other segment you'd get a da-dit. And when you got right on the track to go down the same track that the light line was on, you'd get a steady hum. You know, when you didn't have the A or the N, you just had to hum. That was it now. But I didn't have anything. I didn't have a coffee grinder. You know, the coffee grinder was a low frequency. I didn't have that. P40 didn't have it. So all I had was a light line. So I looked up. I just didn't have any idea where I was heading. To Cheyenne, Wyoming, bear with mine. And yeah, I saw up here, I saw a light line. And every 20 miles, they had a gizmo with a rotating beacon on top. And all of the beacons were just white lights that would flash like that. Except if you had an airfield there. Then you had a white light on one side and a green light on the other side. So when I was just on the fumes, I saw here was a green light. And so I went to that green light and I saw some runway lights. Boy, heaven. So I called on my VHF and I went through all 4 channels, which also included the emergency channel, and no answer. And anyhow, I landed, turned off on the taxiway, headed toward base ops, and just before I got to the ramp in front of base ops, the engine died. I was out of fuel. So I got out of the, and I walked up. I said, well, there's bound to be humans around here somewhere. I hadn't seen any kind of activity. And I walked up to what was obviously the ops segment of the airfield. And they had B-25s there. I think they were B-25s. Anyhow, I walked up there, and I walked in, and I looked up there. It was down in Texas. And so I had no idea where, but I walked in, and if you remember, they had these wall-mounted maps, and with a string, and that was the way you did your flight planning, with a wall-mounted map and a string. And so I looked, we were a long ways from Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so I sat down in the ops office and went to sleep. And first thing I knew, this staff sergeant was shaking me. And he said, "Sir, is that your P-40 out there?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." I was a second lieutenant, by the way. "Yeah, it is." And he said, "Well, we didn't have a flight plan on you because we're closed. We close at 12 o'clock at night. And we aren't open for traffic. And you obviously came in after we were closed." And I said, "Yeah, I did, but I was lost and low on fuel." So anyhow, he said, "Well, we'll pull your airplane in and refuel it, and you can be on your way." So another bullet dodged. One day when I was standing on the ramp outside of our fighter squadron ops, I saw 4 P-47s come in and peel off and land. I'd never met a P-47 pilot before, so I wandered over as they got out of their airplanes when they parked. And by the way, the P-47s were replacing the P-40s in Major Popovich's squadron. And as these pilots debarked, they took off their little cloth helmets. And the first I looked at had long blonde hair, pretty girl. She was a woman. And that absolutely got to me. I thought that was the greatest thing in the world, to see women ferrying those P-47s, and that's what they were doing. After the P-47s were left there was a couple of instructors from down at Richmond, which had a P-47 group. They came up to check us out in the P-47. And I went through a little bit of ground school and read up on the P-47 as best I could and took the exam. And then one of the gentlemen took me out to a P-47 and we walked around, looked at everything on the outside. And he had me get in the cockpit, and I got in, and he helped me all the way through the cockpit checklist, everything that I was supposed to know. And so he said, okay, have a good flight. And he got down out of the steps and onto the ramp, waved to me, and I waved to him and taxied out and took off. He lifted the gear and started to climb. And I said, boy, this is a dog. I thought I was getting a real good airplane. And this won't climb worth a darn. And I said, the P-40, which I thought was pretty much a dog on climbing, would climb better than this. And anyhow, I climbed and on up, and I got up and I did some rolls, and boy, they were terrible. I was dishing out of them, and I was so unhappy. I did a loop and really stalled out on top of the loop. And I said, great Scott, I guess I'll have to increase the speed. Couldn't increase the speed. Anyhow, I said, well, there's something wrong here. I'm going back into the base. So I went in. So I asked the mobile control officer if I could do just a square pattern, which I did. And I came in, and I noticed it took a lot of power. And as I was turning final, my airspeed dropped a lot more than when I pulled the power back, a lot more than I thought. So I had to jam the power back on. And I almost stalled. So I went around, and the mobile control says, Thunderbolt 9, are you having difficulty? And I says, yes, sir, I surely am. And he said, well, it would fly better if you pulled the gear up. And I said, well, I have the gear up. He said, no, from the time you entered the pattern until now, your gear is down. So I looked down, and the gear handle was halfway up. I found then, and nobody had told me this, there's a little latch that you have to flip up. And then you pull the gear up and it'll go all the way up. It's a safety feature, so you can't retract the gear on the ground. Okay, once I got the gear up, I went back up on another flight and did all right. And I found this is a great airplane. The war had wound down, and this was in the fall of 1945. I was told that you're going to be mustered out in late October or early November. So I told Gene, and we were ready to go. We didn't have too many plans, but the only thing that I was really regretting was the fact that I had to stop flying airplanes. I didn't know what I was going to do to keep flying. Well, we drove into Jackson after I got my ruptured duck, which is a lapel pin that everybody was mustered out at the end of World War II, got a ruptured duck. Anyhow, we drove past Jackson Municipal Airport, Hawkins Field. And I looked out, and here was a ramp full of P-51s. I said, great Scots alive, that has to be investigated. So a couple of days later, drove up from where we were staying to the Hawkins Field to the reserve outfit. And I walked in to the commander's office and said, I'm Lieutenant Slay. I was the first lieutenant at the time. Gave him my Form 5. He started leafing through it. And he says, well, you've flown a lot, haven't you? And I said, yes, I have. And he said, I think I could do you a good job. And he said, I think so too. On the 10th of December, which is one day after his final leave is up, you can induct him into the reserve as a reserve first lieutenant. So that was done. And I went up there early one morning and got sworn in as a first lieutenant. And I flew it a lot. I don't know how much time I got, but it's close to 200 hours in the 18 months that I was flying with them. And I had no specific important things to talk about on my P-51 flights, except every Sunday, I think without exception. I went there real early on Sunday morning and checked out a P-51 and flew down to New Orleans, Moisant Airport, north of New Orleans. Landed and parked on the ramp. You could do that in those days. And walked in and had breakfast, including Cafe au Lait, which was famous, New Orleans was famous for. And then on the way back, I might exercise in a little low altitude navigation over my farm in Crystal Springs, Mississippi. And during those days, I had a sideline to flying that I organized and ran a construction company called the Slay Miller Construction Company. And we built garage apartments, which was apartments we put on top of existing two-car, three-car garages, and we sold those. And we built 13 of those during those 18 months. And we built one grocery store, which is a pretty good-sized grocery store, made out of concrete blocks and big enough it wasn't a supermarket, but it was a good-sized grocery store. And then one restaurant down on the banks of the Pearl River.
Yeah, we don't want to leave this one out of the sort, right?
Well, this was a delightful airplane to fly. The Mustang was without a doubt the best air-to-air fighter we had. Escort was in both Europe and in the Pacific was mainly what this airplane was used for. And I just can't say enough about the design of that airplane. It was designed. It was a pilot's airplane. That and the North American F-86. I guess I would have to say that and the F-15 were my two favorite airplanes ever.
Well, we'll get to see them, I guess, a little later, huh? Yeah.
But this one was another airplane that you didn't really need automatic pilot, because you could set it and you could say put it in a 10-degree turn and it would just stay there.
Hanging there.
It was so well designed. And there's nothing in the world that sounds better to me than a flight of P-51s coming over and braking and pulling the throttle back, and you get choke, 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 choke. You remember that sound?
No.
Well, it was, you never would, whenever you were around, no matter where you were, there was a P-51 about to land. You knew it was a P-51 because of the peculiar sound. After a while, after close to 18 months, I got this telegram from 14th Air Force. And it said that I was to be recalled if I wanted to active duty, and I would be given a commission as a regular second lieutenant with my date of rank on my 21st birthday. But I was so glad to get back in the Air Force. I didn't know what to do, so was Gene. And my first assignment was a holding assignment. I didn't know what that meant. At Birmingham, Alabama, which had C-45s, AT-11s, AT-10s, a couple of C-47s, and one C-46. And I eventually got to fly all of those. And also, there was a very enticing ramp across our runway, and there was a National Guard outfit that had P-51s. So I managed to snivel a few lights while I was there, and then got orders, after I'd been there a few months, to Caribbean Air Command headquarters. And I called the DCS personnel and said I had thought I would be assigned to the fighter outfit. And he said, well, we won't decide that until you get here, but yeah, there's a possibility that we could put you in Howard Field with the P-80 outfit. Okay, while I was moving down there, something happened. Number one, the Johnson Act started, and one of the things that the Air Force did to protect their assets, I think, was to move that fighter wing from Howard to Fürstenfeldbruck, Germany, because this was in 1948, and things were getting sort of fierce over there, and the Berlin airlift had started. So, but I was there. The only thing left was to take my red scarf and roll it up and put it in mothballs, which I did. So I started flying pretty soon after that, again, and I was flying C-47s and A-26s and bug smashers. But I flew this thing a lot, all over, once a month when I was stationed in Panama, when the Johnson Axe caught my fighter wing and terminated it, just right after I had arrived in the theater. I sort of transitioned to flying the Goonie Bird. And I got to be an absolute expert Goonie Bird pilot. And I could take this thing in, and did, into dirt strips about 1,200 feet long. Like Tegucigalpa, Honduras, for instance. They had a 1,200-foot grass dirt strip. But I went in there once a month. And I went all over South America and all the islands. In those days, we had missions practically everywhere. And we serviced them basically with Goonie Birds. And we didn't have many, and we didn't have many pilots. One of the most interesting flights I took during my tour in Panama was a C-54 flight to all the way around South America to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and back up through the Antilles chain back to Panama. And the reason it was interesting was that I was dragooned into being the pilot, although I was totally unqualified. I had a total of 5 hours in the airplane. Turned out I was the only pilot assigned to Albrook that had any C-54 time at all, and I had never made a landing or takeoff. Colonel Green, who was DCS Ops of Caribbean Air Command, said that he had total confidence that I could manage it, that he had flown with me into both Quito and La Paz, which was the two worst airfields that I dreaded trying to go into unqualified. Told me to go down and get myself qualified in the C-54, which I did. So I selected a major as my co-pilot, and Paul Terrace, who was a C-54 crew chief who had been left there by the 20th Ship Carrier when they went to Germany. He and two mechanics, C-54 mechanics, had been left there. So we went out and started it up and went out, and I got a whole bunch of landings and takeoffs that afternoon and some at night. I did short field takeoffs, short field landings, and every doggone one of them were grease jobs. So I confessed myself that I was an expert C-54 pilot, and okay. General Ridgway and his entourage showed up the next morning, loaded them up, and took off for Quito, and climbed up to Quito and 9,000 odd feet, and visual flight rules, and I looked and saw that grass field down there. Never landed a C-54 on a grass field, but I said, okay, that ought not to be any problem. So I went off, and I could tell my co-pilot was sweating nails, as was my crew chief. But I went in and landed at Quito with no problem, and I became more convinced that I was the world's foremost C-54 pilot. So we spent the night there. The next day, we took off and flew to Lima, Peru. Spent the night there. Following morning, we took off for La Paz. Went up the Tirana Pass, which is the way you get to La Paz from Lima, and a flight altitude about 16,000 feet, which barely kept you above the terrain. And climbing up, halfway there, I remembered that people in the back didn't have oxygen, and neither did my co-pilot. or me, or my crew chief. But we rationalized this, I did, that thousands lived up at that altitude, so we ought to make it okay. So with that rationalization, we continued on, and nobody died in the back. We landed there, and General Ridgway told me he really enjoyed the flight up and got to see a lot of Toronto Pass, and his wife even got a nice snooze on the way up. And I thought, oh God, that was the lack of oxygen, I'm sure. But we got there, and I made my biggest mistake of the trip. I didn't tell Paul Terrace to load up only half fuel because of our takeoff at that altitude the next morning. And the airplane itself was very heavy with all of the VIP equipment, big overstuffed seats and cushions and bed and a refrigerator and a hot plate and all that kind of stuff. So I dashed in and tried to find a defueling equipment. Not any. And then the Panagra ops guy said, well, we never load up with fuel, full fuel. And I says, well, thanks for telling me that. Well, went out and didn't have a flight handbook. I remembered belatedly that I had left it at home. I had taken it home with me the night before the trip to bone up on the fine details of flying a C-54. Didn't have one. So we just guessed. And the three of us guessed, my co-pilot, Paul Terrace, and me, that if I, just for make sure, I'd use the 500 feet overrun on the takeoff in, and surely any airplane can get off in 10,500 feet. And then I made another mistake. I said, Paul, should I use blowers or not? He reminded me that he was a crew chief, not a flight engineer. He didn't know. And my co-pilot, a major, he didn't know either. So we both said, I said, well, you know, blowers use energy to spin up. And we're up at this altitude, and it may be that it takes more energy to spin it up than you'd get out of it. And gross rationalization, because I really didn't know whether it was used or not, so I didn't use it. And as a consequence of that 10,500 feet, we used up about 10,400 feet. We taxied out at La Paz to take off, and but at any rate, I did use the additional 500 feet of gravel overrun on that end of the runway and turnaround. So we had 10,500 feet of runway. So I pushed it up and released the brakes and headed down the runway. And we used up almost all of the runway and lifted off the ground. And Paul Terrace, who was the crew chief, had briefed him, when I say gear up, Paul, get the gear up, but leave the flaps alone, which he did, and we had a hills right in front of us. So I made a left turn, which would take me 1,500 feet lower if I had to use it, down to Lake Titicaca. And so that's what I did, and we gained airspeed and got down to Lake Titicaca and circled a couple of three times to get up above the mountains. General Ridgway complimented me on the flight and said he and his wife greatly enjoyed the tour of Lake Titicaca that I gave them and the circles there. I don't know whether he was kidding me or not, but I chose to feel that he was not. He was just actually enjoyed the flight, and I enjoyed not running into the mountain. While I was Director of Flight Safety, we got word that one of our C-47s was missing on a flight to Guatemala City. And so it turned out that we eventually found out from a radio call to the owner of a coffee finca up in northeast Guatemala that an aircraft had crashed very close to his finca. And so I asked if there's anybody alive. He says, well, we haven't gone into the airplane, but could nobody have survived it, so they're obviously dead. So I went to Colonel Green. I said, I have to go up there find that place and see how we can get in, and I'll investigate in my capacity as Director of Flying Safety. I'll investigate the accident, and at the same time, I'll take a bunch of people with me to go in and get the bodies, put them in body bags, and we'll come back out. I said, the only problem is finding a place to land. So he said, well, do the best you can. And I said, if I have to rent an airplane up there, can I rent an airplane? And he said, well, yes, as long as you can fly it, you can rent it. So I went up there, and I found from people on the ground in Guatemala City where this Finca was. So I went up in my C-47 and circled a few times and found what I thought was the Finca, and there was no flat spot anywhere that I could tell. So I said, oh boy. So I came back, and somebody, and I can't remember who, knew how to get in touch with this coffee Finca owner on the radio. So he called him on the radio and said we wanted to come up, and where could we land the C-47? And he said, you can't. There isn't a place up here that you can land. He said, I have one flat spot that I think I can cut out maybe 1,000 feet out of the bush. That's reasonably level. But he said, I'm not sure you can get a C-47 in there. So I called Colonel Green back and told him, he said, well, do the best you can. So I went over and found this organization, a local organization, that had 3 tri-motor Fords. And so I talked to them and said, what I would like to do is to lease one of your airplanes and take it up to this wreck and retrieve the bodies up there. And I said, the coffee Finca owner thinks he can cut out enough space for me to land. And down there on his Finca. So I said, you will have to check me out and certify me to be qualified in a tri-motor before we do that, obviously. And he said, obviously, we want to do that. So he did, and I got up and did several landings in the tri-motor, including short field landings, short field takeoffs. One interesting thing that I had trouble getting used to, the brakes were not brakes that you apply like that. They had a big stick in the center of the cockpit that you pulled back for both brakes on, right for right brake on, and left for left brake on. And you could have any kind of combination of that. So I got pretty competent on that. So I took off, found the Finca, and sure enough, I saw the place they had cut out. And I circled and circled, and I flew over it and said, well, I think I can land there. And I did, and then wrecked the airplane. So we spent 2 nights there and collected the bodies and took off and went back to Panama. This old bird here, I even gave Gene some flight time in this airplane.
You did?
B-17, yeah.
No kidding.
I was fully qualified in a B-17. But Gene flew with me twice. And I flew the B-17, strangely enough, a good bit, in Panama. We only had one. And it was configured for VIP transport. She was very interested in the B-17. So I took her around it and showed her all there was to show, and showed her where to sit for a takeoff. And when we got up, the co-pilot went back and got Jean and brought her up, and she sat in the right seat. And so we flew. I don't think we ever got above 1,000 feet. But we flew all over the place. You know, you get on the end of the runway and you run the power up. She said it was just like an old bull pawing the ground. She could, it was.
Yeah, getting ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was a beautiful airplane for what it was designed.
And I've seen some pictures of just absolutely torn apart airplanes still flying, making a landing.
That's right. But it was a good airplane. I enjoyed flying it. One of the things that I undertook as Director of Flying Safety of the Caribbean Air Command was to publish what I call the en route procedures for Latin America. And I enlisted the help of all of the airlines, and they gave me all of their letdown procedures, all of their aerofare frequencies, their tower frequencies if they had special towers, and their control frequencies, everything that I could possibly need. Also, I arranged with them to bill the Air Force directly for fuel and maintenance at their facility. And that worked like a charm, really. It worked perfect. And it took me about, I guess, 8 months to get this thing done and to get it published. And did I ever show you a copy of it? Yeah. But not only in that little book, Al, I had not only the things for pilots in the air, I had things for pilots on the ground. Good places to stay, what was a good restaurant, and how much they were going to have to pay for a good bottle of Chilean wine, which happened to be about 38 cents. And, you know, it was more than a flight manual.
Full service manual.
Yeah, it was full service manual. I was called up to General Green's office, Colonel Green at the time, and he told me that I had a new job as of that afternoon. I was going to be Director of Flying Safety for the Caribbean Air Command. Another thing that I did is set up a jungle survival school. And I spent a lot of time with the San Blas Indians by myself. I went out there in a crash boat from Franceville on the Caribbean side, and they dropped me off and picked me up 3 days later. And there was only one person, he was a chief, that spoke any Spanish at all. And I spoke good Spanish in those days, but he and I finally got to where we could converse. And he and two of his guys took me over to the mainland, and we went through he taught me everything that I learned about how to survive in the jungle. And I ate everything, and we've spent 3 days with he and his two tribesmen. And one of the things that I may have mentioned to you is that as we were cutting a path through the jungle, the undergrowth, he would be here and I would be behind him. There'd be another guy over here cutting a path, another guy over here cutting a path. And I finally got to where I could converse with this guy well enough and ask him why that was. And he says, "Oh, that's the green tree mamba." I said, "What?" And he said, "Oh yes, that's the most deadly snake in Panama." And he says he goes out and hunts at night, but during the day he sleeps. And he's in the low part of the undergrowth. And as you're cutting through, the first guy in wakes him up. The second guy through, he gets mad and he pops the third guy. So that was their folklore. And so that's the reason none of the Indians wanted to go third in line. So they cut their own path through the jungle. But that was not the Bushmaster. The green tree mama was the biggest one I ever saw. It was about that long. But they were like a cobra. They had that kind of instant killer poison. The Bushmaster that I ran into, I didn't have the survival group with me at the time. I was still learning, and I would go out in the jungle by myself, drop me off about halfway between Albrook and Franceville, and I would go out on my own and spend the night, 2 days and one night, in the jungle by myself. And that's when, by the way, I would take a carbine with me on those trips. I wouldn't allow any weapons or any kind. I'd allow one weapon that I would assign to one guy. We have 15 people in the school, and one machete. But on this trip, I had a machete and also the carbine. I was walking along this trail, animal trail, and I heard something rustling out to my right side, and I would stop. I said, I wonder what that is. And it would stop. And I would move, and it would move. So I looked up ahead, and there was another trail that was cutting across the trail I was on. So I said, well, I'm going to run like crazy and get up there and be prepared to shoot whatever it is. And I got up there just as this big snake started across the cross trail. So I emptied my magazine at him and killed him. He was still thrashing around when I got up to him. I didn't know what he was. And a great big snake, that big around big snake. And it obviously was not a boa constrictor, because I know boas real well, and this one was not at all patterned like a boa, and his fangs were not like a boa. On his tail, he had a protuberance that stuck out of his tail and went up at an angle of about 45 degrees, about that long. And I never did know what that was for, but it's sort of like a rattlesnake's rattle, I guess. I cut off the snake's head and took it to the zoo in Panama City. They said, yeah, that's a Bushmaster. And when I told him that it was 11 feet long, by my steps, I figured it was 11 feet, because I stretched him out and stepped off and said, my guess is it's 11 feet. And I said, that's a monster. He had never heard of one that big. So he sent the head to some herpetologist in Miami. And the guy said, yes, that's a Colombian Bushmaster. And the biggest one he had ever heard of. So that was where the Bushmaster tail came from. And that's my old P-80.
Now, did you have actually operational units, P-80 in Korea?
Oh, yes, we did. But I went through CCTS at Nellis in F-80s before I did the F-86.
I don't remember.
Very poor visibility. With me sitting in the cockpit, you see where the canopy sill is?
Right.
My nose came right there.
Yeah.
It was very difficult to see out. One of the problems, as I got older, the you could do that way and nothing happened. I mean, the controls were so poor. Let's see, there's another one that I see extremely familiar. I flew that one a lot. It's the F-94. And that happens to be the F-94B. No, the A. It's hard to tell the difference between the A and the B. But it had 4 forward-firing 50s, but you could not make a cutoff attack. And I was on an air defense outfit at Newcastle, Delaware, flying these things, and all of our intercepts were out over the Atlantic.
So this is ADC, Air Defense Command.
Air Defense Command, yeah. And the powers that be were absolutely convinced that the Soviet bulls were going to come down the GI-UK gap. But the crazy thing about this airplane here, you look and you see how roomy that cockpit is. Yeah. Forget it. You know, on this airplane, I could wear either a parachute or a dinghy. I couldn't wear both. If I tried to wear a seat parachute and a seat dinghy, my head was up against the canopy. If I tried to wear a back parachute and a seat dinghy, I would leave my kneecaps, if I ejected, on the rail around the windscreen.
Wow.
But Bob Mangone was my buff diver, and he was watching. He would have no problem in the back because there's nothing to hit his knees. And so he got down and he said, Al, if what I'm going to do right now, I'm going downtown and buy me a billy club that'll fit inside my boot. And if we ever have to bail out over the Atlantic, and I have my dinghy and you don't have one, then you're going to try to swim and I have this big billy club, I'm going to beat you off my dinghy. We found out that all of our fuel trucks were contaminated with water, and all fuel in the airplane flows into the fuselage tank, which only had 47 gallons. And it had valves that were stacked on top of each other called Schultz valves. Well, what had happened is when we were about as far as we could get out into the Atlantic on this particular occasion, and the Schultz valve froze in a closed position, so that the fuel that was in the fuselage tank could not get into, you could get no more fuel in there, and you couldn't get the fuel from the wing tanks and leading edge tank into the fuselage tank. So that meant I was not in good shape. So I climbed up as fast as I could, did a mayday and said I was going to flame out. Sure enough, when I was in sight of the Atlantic City lights, I was heading up north of Atlantic City under GCI control. A GCI site right out near Atlantic City. And I told them I was going to make an emergency landing. This was about 2:30 in the morning at Atlantic City Navy. And I told that I wanted to make a very high altitude, high speed approach to the runway. And I wanted them to put me 90 degrees to the runway heading about 5 miles out. And I was going to come in at about 8,000, 9,000 feet. And them to turn me onto the runway heading, and then I would dive down through the clouds. We had an undercast that you could see the lights under the undercast from the city, but you couldn't see the runway lights. So I dived down under. By the way, we had flamed out. I forgot that. We flamed out in sight of the sight of the city lights of Atlantic City. I was totally dependent on the GCI to do that for me because I had no thought. I couldn't see the runway, couldn't see the airfield, couldn't see any of the lights. But I dived down underneath when I broke out, perfectly lined up on the runway. I was doing about 100 knots too fast, but I was so speed brakes, yawing, gear down, flaps down, and I landed and got to the end of the runway, turned off, and didn't need to shut the airplane down because it's already shut down. And as we turned off the end of the runway, and Mangone and I were about to debark from our airplane, I said, "Well, Bob, we dodged another bullet, didn't we? And just another routine flight." And he said, "Well, my only regret, I didn't get to use my billy club on you when we had to eject out over the Atlantic." And there we are. Beautiful old Sabre. Now this is I flew all of my missions in Korea, all my flying in Korea was with hard wing F. This is an E model with the slats. And the reason that the Air Force went to the hard wing is in an air combat If you're going up, trying to outmaneuver your enemy, as your airspeed lowers, these things automatically come out. And you know what's going to happen. You not only increase the lift, but you increase the drag, and your enemy will go zip right past you. So we went to the hard wing, which is the F, which is what I flew over there. But I flew the E a good bit. As a matter of fact, I went through CCTS at Nellis in the E and not the F. Somebody asked me to describe in layman's terms what I thought of the F-86. I said, well, you didn't fly an F-86, you wore it. In other words, it was just part of the pilot. I mean, you could just think about what you wanted to do, and it would do it for you. It was just a beautiful airplane. Flight control was beautiful, everything, and it was almost physically impossible to make a bad landing. We didn't do much escorting, and we were, as the Marines call it, air mud, and the 8th. That was our job, was basically air to ground. But the 51st and the 4th wings were the air pirates, and they were basically the air-to-air wings. But sometimes they had air-to-air missions that they didn't want to fly, so they turned them over to us. Well, we flew a lot of recce escort missions, and these RB-45s were stationed in Japan. And you would go out and meet them off the west coast, escort them up, either up the west coast or the east coast. Now, on this particular mission, I had a flight of 4, and we were going to escort the RB up the west coast and up to the Yalu River. And they were to take pictures. They had long-range, side-looking cameras in the RB-45. And a lot of pictures that they were going to fly up all the way to the Yalu, turn around and come back. Well, when we got to the rendezvous point, no B-45, RB-45, and we circled, and you guess, he finally came, but we had already used up a lot of gas. And as we were going up, I had told the RB-45 pilot that we probably were not going to be able to take him all the way to the Yalu because we were low on gas. Well, we got up to 3/4 of the way up and got this call from the ground control that the MiGs had taken off from just across the Yalu in China and were heading for our flight, our formation. So that kind of shook up the RB pilot. And I said, well, we'll stay with you as long as we can. Well, we stayed a little too long. And finally, I got a bingo call from my number 3 or 4 guy, I forget which. So I sent him home and wound up that 2 of them bingoed. Bingo, by the way, is when you have just barely enough fuel to get back home. And I had to send 2 of them back. And not long after that, we both I told the RB pilot, and by the way, the MiG-15s turned around and went back. They didn't approach us. So we turned around when that happened, and my last wingman and me, and headed back home. Well, by the time we got over South Korea, my guy was on emergency fuel. The guy was flying with me. And I had the red light on, low level fuel line. So we called the K-13 tower, I did, and told him about our problems. And he said, well, we have one F-86 flamed out and it's patterned now landing, and another that is declared an emergency and says he's about to flame out. My guys. Well, to make a long story short, by the time I'd made a couple of circles to let my wingman get in. I got on base leg and I flamed out. So all of us wound up at the end of the runway over on the taxiway. Nobody hurt. We wound up flamed out. So it's four F-86s, and it was all my fault. So I immediately went in to the group commander, and I was a captain. I'd just been promoted to major, but I hadn't put them on. And I was combat ops officer. And I said, boss, his name was Locke. And I said, Colonel Locke, you should fire me because I was derelict in my duty on this flight. And I didn't protect my wingman, and I didn't send him home as soon as I could. And I said, I knew we were getting low on fuel, but the call from them about the MiG-15s broke something in my head, and I said, we have to stay with the RB-45. And I said, I shouldn't have done that. I should have sent them home earlier. And he said, well, what was it you want to talk to me about? And I said, well, boss, I just did. And he said, don't you have something better to do? So that was the end of that.
Yeah.
Just before I left, somebody, I don't know who, decided we'd have a gunnery meet in 5th Air Force. So we put together a team, five of us, and we went out and practiced. We didn't have any problem with air to ground because that's what all of us did and had been doing ever since we'd been there. But we were having a little bit of trouble with air to air because, that wasn't our mission. Our mission was air to mud. The 4th Wing and the 51st were the air to air wings. But we beat them out in air to air. And we beat the 18th and we beat all the other wings in 5th Air Force. In both air to air and air to ground. Then we had the FIF meet, 40th Air Force. Well, when we won the FIF meet, we got to go to Nellis. And the 5th Air Force commander gave us a C-135 to go there. We flew in the C-135 to Alexandria, Louisiana, and the wing commander there happened to be the wing commander on the last, just before the current wing commander, at the 8th Wing. So he was just welcomed us with open arms. And so we borrowed hard wing 86s from him. All much better airplanes than we had because they were newer. But we picked up our F-86s there, flew to Eglin, where we could do a lot of practice. We all got thrown off the range the first 2 times we tried dive bombing because we were pulling out too low. We didn't think we would make as good a score dropping our bombs at higher altitude. So what we decided to do was that we would just make a real high-G pullout so that we could drop our bombs at the same place, but we wouldn't make a nice pullout. We would come down and do like that. So we did that, and Eglin didn't throw us off the range. So from then on, there and at Nellis, that's all of us did that, 90-degree turn at the bottom, and over-G'ing the airplane, something fierce. But as I think I may have told you, a meet at Nellis we couldn't have asked for better luck. And we won air to ground over all of the wings in the Air Force, fighter wings. And came in number 2 on air to air. Nellis beat us out. But on air to ground, although Nellis in those days didn't give individual awards, I won both low altitude and high altitude bombing. And my skip bombing was 100%. Everyone went through the target. And my high angle bombing, I think my CEP was 8 feet. So anyhow, getting back, we delivered the airplanes back down to Alexandria, Louisiana. And we all got out of the airplane, and our C-135 was there to pick us up and take us back to Korea. And so the wing commander was down, and his ops officer, as sergeant, come up and take him over to one of the airplanes. And I saw him, I knew what was happening. He was running his hands over the top of the wings. And he went over to another airplane and ran his hands over. What had happened is, these are flush rivets, and the rivets, saw a lot of the rivets had popped. And I said, oh my, we're in absolute trouble. Anyhow, this lieutenant colonel, he's colonel, ops guy for the wing, came up and he was whispering to the wing commander, and the wing commander said, it don't matter, we got to fix it anyhow. It don't matter. And I says, maybe the best luck that we've ever had is that this guy was once the wing commander of the 8th Wing, and he considers us his guys. All 4 of our airplanes had to have repair of those popped rivets. He called Jack Locke later after we got back to Korea and said, just so you know, there was no permanent damage done. It didn't take us all that much to repair them, but he said we had to repair every one of them. That's the thing that was coming after us. MiG-15.
MiG-15.
I flew that twice, and the 17 and the 23 and the 21. Flew all of them.
Now, we got a hold of that by having one of them defect, is that right?
No. The ones I flew, I'd probably have to kill you if I told you.
Okay.
I flew the B-58, and I flew it without the pod and with the pod. It was a beautiful flying airplane, but it didn't have this fuel system. I have to tell you about it. When you're flying along and you get wing heavy, one thing has happened. You're using more fuel on one side than you are the other. Yes, sir. You know how you transferred fuel? Putting in yaw. Oh. That's the way you transferred fuel from one wing to the other.
In the B-58?
Yeah, B-58.
Wow. Let's see now, that was supersonic airplane, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, Mach 2. You'd never guess where I was when I got checked out in the 102. I was in the Pentagon.
Oh yeah.
That's when I had the fighter requirements.
Now, where did they put the flying schedule in?
I went out and volunteered at Palmdale to once a month I would fly 1 day's worth, which happened to be 4 or 5 missions in the 102 for production acceptance. I was given the job in the Director of Requirements as Chief of Air Defense Fighter Requirements. So I quickly rationalized that I had to be current in fighters. So I went out. I had a buddy at Andrews that quickly checked me out in T-33 because he knew I'd flown it a lot, and told me to keep that under my hat because my boss, who was a colonel, had been on the checkout list for 6 months and hadn't been checked out yet. So that's what having buddies will do for you. But I also decided I needed to fly the F-102. So I took T-33 out to Palmdale, found another guy who wasn't a buddy, but I knew pretty well, who was the chief of a production flight test. These airplanes were being put together by Convair at Palmdale, and they were all getting tested, production flight test at Palmdale. So I convinced him, because of my august new job, Director of Fighter Requirements, I needed to fly the F-102. All of their production acceptance test flights were done at Palmdale. So I'd go over to Palmdale and spend a day flying a 102, and then fly my T-Bird over to Edwards and fly whatever they would let me fly. I was down at Hurlbut in Florida. I was commander of a test outfit down there. And I took off for Wright-Patterson in this T-33 with a guy in the back seat who was also a T-33 pilot, Bob Taylor. And we got our weather briefing, and we took off from Hurlbut. And you know where Hurlbut is from Eglin. And we headed north out of Hurlbut. And as I was about crossing the Alabama border, I started to get severe turbulence. And the further I went, the more severe the turbulence got. And again, to make a long story short, we got to about 15,000 feet, and the airplane was about to come apart. And then all of a sudden, the engine flamed out. So I put in a mayday call and tried to restart the engines, and I couldn't restart them. I told Bob Taylor in the back to eject, and he ejected. And I said, well, I'm going to try it one more, and I hit the starting fuel sequencing switch again, and the ass end of the airplane blew off. What had happened, the accident board finally determined after the fact, was that the turbulence had broken a fuel line loose. And when I hit the starting fuel sequencing switch, it just was pumping raw fuel into the plenum chamber, and that's what caused the explosion. Well, we were tumbling, and I pulled the green apple. You know what a green apple is? Well, the green apple is on your bailout bottle, and it lets your, the oxygen go from your bailout bottle into your oxygen mask.
You get off the aircraft oxygen and get on your own personal. Yeah.
And of course, all I was interested in then is getting out of the airplane. But I couldn't breathe because there was no oxygen coming out of the green bottle, the emergency oxygen. So I took my mask off took my mask off and ejected. And I guess I was at about 12 or 13,000 feet when I ejected. And the chute was extremely hard jerk. It opened, and but it's stabilized. And I looked up, and there were several panels missing out of the chute. Also, I noticed that things were icing up, and instead of going down, I was going up. And I was in the middle of a terrible updraft. And I got up, I don't know how many minutes after that, but the chute collapsed from the weight of ice on it, and I plummeted down, and it caught again, and then it started up. And it did that 5 times. And when I finally broke out of the clouds, the chute had been swinging like that due to the panels that were missing. And as I was coming out of the clouds, I looked down just in time to be able to put my hands in front of. I was coming right down on pine trees. And so I crashed through these pine trees. And by the way, this was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And turned out that they had heard my mayday call, and they had notified Gene that something had happened, and they were out looking for me. But when I stopped going down through the pine boughs, I opened my eyes, and I was all beat up, and this oxygen mask had flapped and flapped and flapped and took all the meat off my chin, and my front of my flying suit was just red with blood from my chin. But when I finally looked around, my feet were about that high off the ground. The chute had caught, and so I unbuckled and tried to get the chute. I couldn't get the chute down. I didn't have any idea what happened to Bob Taylor, because he had bailed out a good bit before I did, maybe a couple of 3 minutes before I did. And I started calling him, and the wind and the rain was coming down like you wouldn't believe. So I said, well, I'm going to start to circle here and see if I can find Bob. So I tried as best I could to figure out what direction to go. And this was nothing but pine trees. Everywhere you looked was pine tree. And so I finally, after about an hour and a half, 2 hours, it was quite clear I was not going to find Bob. So I said, well, I've got to figure out a way to get out of here. So I started in what I thought was an easterly direction. No way I could tell, because it was, by this time it was night, it was dark. It was pretty dark anyhow with all the clouds. And by the way, it turned out we had bailed out in the middle of a tornado. That was, had been in the air from the time I ejected until the time I was, my feet were on the ground, was 33 minutes. And that was ejecting from about 12,000 feet. But, you know, that was, but anyhow, I got down and I started walking. And I walked, and I walked. And I had the vision of, I was just making circles. But I came to an area that had been cleared. It was on a crescent. And it was what looked like oats, and I said, this can't be. But it's something that somebody had planted in a crescent out in these woods. There's a big crescent too. So I walked across it, and about this time, way in the distance, I heard a train whistle. And I says, aha, where there's trains, there's bound to be people. So I'm going to head toward that train whistle. So I started walking, and I said, well, I haven't heard the train whistle in a while. I don't know whether I'm retracing my steps or what I'm doing, because I could not figure out the headings, because it was still raining like crazy and dark. But anyhow, pretty soon I heard the train whistle again, right directly in front of me. So I had stayed on course. Well, I continued walking, and about, I guess, 1:30 in the morning, I happened upon a hog wire fence. And I said, well, you know, deer didn't make this fence. And I almost ran into it. And I looked over, and here was a greatly overgrown garden as far as I could see out. And I said, well, there's bound to be people around here. I came upon this house, and bear in mind now, this is around 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And I looked like hell, and I had all this blood all over me. And I still had my helmet on, but I'd thrown the oxygen mask away. And my feet were that big around with mud. And everything from here down was mud. So I knocked on this door, and this man came to the door in his skivvies. And I said, well, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Slay, and I have just bailed out about 11 hours ago, and I got my partner is out there somewhere, I don't know where he is, and I need some help to try to find him. So he said, come in the house, come in the house. I said, I can't. I've got to get these muddy shoes off. I can't come in your house like this. He pulled me in the house, made as wet and dirty as I was, made me sit down on a couch. So I asked if he had a phone after I got my boots off, and yeah, he had one of these wall crank. He said, well, let me get the operator. And so he rang and got the operator. And I told him the number that I wanted at Eglin. And sure enough, somebody answered. And I knew I was in deep, serious trouble when the chaplain answered at my house. Well, Jean likes to tell this story, that she served coffee and crumpets and donuts to everybody that was there, you know, after she had heard from 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this was about 3 o'clock in the morning, 12 hours later. And she said she wasn't worried because she knew I could walk through raindrops without getting wet until the chaplain showed up. And he was sort of sprinkling the holy water over, commiserating and saying how sorry he was. And then she started to get worried. Well, fortunately, soon after that, I called. And she said she would call. I said, I don't know where Bob is. I haven't found him, but he is the fellow that owns this house is trying to get some people together to help look for him. And so she said, well, I will call his wife, which she did. And we hung up. And by that time, he had gotten the phone, and he had called the sheriff. And the sheriff had called a whole bunch of people. 30 minutes after I talked to Gene, people started coming in the front of his house. It was out in the woods. I mean, really in the woods, with just a little dirt road coming up to his house. And there were all sorts of people. There was a Forestry Service guy also there, and he said, well, do you see anything that you recognize? And I said, no, except this crescent-shaped clearing. And he says, how big was it? And I told him. And he says, I planted that. I know exactly where it is. So he was appointed to lead the procession of about 15 vehicles. We went out and went way up to the north, back in, and he knew exactly, it's still dark, knew exactly how to get in. But we got there, and he assigned one of his deputies to go in this direction, one in that direction, one in this direction. And I went with the sheriff himself, and we headed in a direction which I thought I came from. Turned out it was correct, because we walked in about daylight. We came to the tree with my chute in it. And I said, well, how do we go about finding Bob Taylor? So he had told his people that if you find any sign of Lieutenant Taylor, I want you to fire 3 shots, bang, 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 with your pistol. So after we were sitting there trying to figure out which direction we could go, we heard this pistol shot. And also the thought was they didn't have radios. I don't know why. They didn't. Every 15 minutes they would fire off another shot or two. To make a long story short, we came up, they had found Bob Taylor, and Bob had a little knot on his head, and what he had done, well, by the way, another thing, I had run a jungle survival school in Panama for 2 years, and I was the most expert guy at survival in unkind environment in the Air Force, I'm sure, because I had spent so many nights on my own in the bad jungles with all sorts of varmints around. I had nothing. I had no matches. I had no medical stuff. I had nothing in my pockets. Bob had everything. And he had taken the remains of his parachute down and made a tent. And he had a little bottle that he had matches in this little bottle. And so he had gone around to logs and gotten dry stuff somehow and managed to build himself a fire in front of his, and he was sitting there leaning back, waiting. I said, Bob, come out here, I want to kill you. And we had 4 squadrons, one of which was RB-57Fs, which was a high-altitude reconnaissance airplane. Well, this is an airplane I never flew, but it's a predecessor of one that I did flew a lot. And as a matter of fact, I was a commander of an outfit that had them associated in Germany. found out that I had 3 squadrons. One was stationed at Wiesbaden Air Base, and it was flying 4 different kinds of airplanes. Their entire mission was Berlin corridors, and they were servicing Berlin. All the military operations in Berlin they serviced with my squadron. And they serviced it with CT-29s, if you know what those are, and C-97s, and C-47s, and one other. Yes, the other one was a C-130 squadron, and we had a bunch of those, and we didn't own the people in the back. Those belonged to a different command altogether, and every time the long wing was up, this airplane was somewhere, one of these airplanes, or 2 of them, were somewhere in the vicinity with their back-end crew working. But my people, my crew, were not allowed in the back of the airplane. This is the RB-57D, which was a pale predecessor of the RB-57F that we had. The RB-57F was a totally different airplane. Instead of having 2 engines, it had 4 engines. And instead of having those engines, it had great big TF-33s mounted in the wings. They were twice as big as that. Plus, on a pod, they had a turbojet engine on each side. So it had 4 engines. And the wings were bigger and more flexible. They were longer. And when you loaded the wings with the airplane with fuel, and you were sitting on the ramp, the wingtips were about that high off the concrete. And under the wingtips were skids, so that when you were taxiing and you crossed on the ramp, a little raise between segments of the ramp, the wingtips would fold a little bit, and those little skids would actually tap the concrete. Radio silence from the time we left the hangar until we got back in the hangar. Taxied out to the center taxiway, and the control tower gave us a green light. That meant we were clear to go. You'd go out on the runway and turn toward the half of the runway that was left, push your 2 throttles for the main 2 engines up to 70% power. Release the brakes, pull the wheel back, and you leave the ground. And so we'd start to climb, and as we got to about 48,000 or 50,000, I would start the 2 turbojet engines, which were hung under the wings. And as it looked like our indicator airspeed was dropping a bit, I'd shove those up until they were on the red line. All 4 engines were operated on the red line the entire mission. And then, from then on, we'd cruise climb to where when we entered our mission area, we would be a minimum of 68 to 70,000 feet.
Wow.
And still climbing. And we climbed throughout the mission until we were headed back home. I only built 13 of them, and we had them all in my group. We didn't have any electronics on when we were on our mission. So we didn't have any beacon to follow, nothing like that. Everything was off. And it was 100% pilotage. And the way it was pilotage was done was the backseater had this vertical looking camera, television, and he would look down and spot things on the ground. And he had to be good because we were constantly turning this way and that way. And I never worried. I didn't know where we were. Didn't really care because my life was in his hands, the guy in the back seat, because he was telling me what to do to turn this way and that way for 2 reasons: to keep us out of harm's way and to get close to where the cameras could capture whatever we wanted to capture. I had a facility with people at Bolo, Norway. I had one had two in Turkey, at Diyarbakir, and at can't remember the name of the other little airfield. I had one in Greece. I had two in Iran, one right up on the Caspian Sea. But these were not units, they were just operating elements there to support the long wings. And there were only 3 or 4 people, and all of them were NCOs and at every place. And they did an absolutely fantastic job and never got really recognized for what they did. I got promoted to Brigadier General, and I was assigned to headquarters, United States Air Forces in Europe, USAF, and my boss was, guess who, David C. Jones. And one of my favorite guys. He and I had first crossed paths when we were both colonels in the Pentagon, and we were working a steady that lasted about 3 months. And he was running the steady, and I was one of his minions as a brand new colonel. He knew me real well and said, Al, you're now signed in, and what I want you to do is take your first month and fly with whoever you want to fly. Get checked out. I want you to occasionally set alert, nuclear alert. And he said, I want you to fly Air Force. So I said, boss, you couldn't have told me anything that tickles me more. So I went to Spangdahlem to get checked out in the F-4. And, the Air Force didn't have any F-4s at that time. Strangely enough, I don't think they had any wing in the ZI, the U.S. And the one at Spangdahlem and at Bitburg, those 2 bases were the first bases in USAF to get F-4s. And Spangdahlem was a training base. And our instructor pilots, the first one I saw was a Navy lieutenant. And I didn't know what the heck the Navy lieutenant was doing being an IP, but they had F-4s on their carriers, and they had it. They were the only ones that had enough experience to be an IP. So the only problem was their traffic pattern was you turned until you were about 10 feet off the ground, and then you pounded it into the runway. And the airspeed that you kept on final was about 20 knots lower than I thought it should be. So as soon as I got checked out, I started flying Air Force patterns and airspeeds on final. But that was my introduction to the F-4. And all of the F-4s over there were assigned to the, what I would call, Strategic Air Command nuclear mission. And we sat alert with a nuclear shape underneath the airplane. Most of our flying was done at low altitude. And the Navy guy took me on, he knew that we were going to be flying low altitude. So we took off from Spangdahlem on one of the low altitude routes in Germany. And we were flying along at 500 feet. And all of a sudden I heard the exclamation in the back seat, and he was looking down. And he says, look at that guy, he's down on the deck. And it was German F-104. And sure enough, he was down in the weeds, going like crazy. That turned out to be the average, the normal altitude on those low altitude rights in Germany was 200, 250 feet above the terrain. I walked into General Jones' office, and he told me there was somebody on the phone that wanted to talk to me. And I picked up the phone, And it was General Jim Ferguson, and also he had a chief staff on the phone with him, but Jim Ferguson did most of the talking. And he said, "Al, you've worked for me a couple of times, and I have asked the chief and I've asked General Jones if they would mind if I took you and gave you a new assignment." And I said, "Oh my, what's this? Supply officer someplace?" And he said, "I want you to go out to Edwards, and I'll tell you why. We've just had the Air Force IG out there looking into what happened to the XB-70 accident. And they came back and briefed the chief that there was a lot of things that needed to be tended to as far as discipline and rules out there in both NASA and in the Air Force." So I said, "Well, boss, I'll tell you, I would dearly love to go out as commander of Edwards. I've never dreamed that I would have that opportunity, but it's sort of, it would be the peak of anybody's career to be out there and be commander of all of those nice airplanes." So I said, "Yes, but I dislike the idea of going out there to try to put discipline into the system that isn't there. My guess is that all they need is a little tweaking, and I can do that." The A7 was just starting in test when I was at Edwards. And I was one of the, strangely enough, even as commander, I was one of the prime test pilots for the A7D. And we were developing it as a long-range close air support and the bomber, but close air support principally. So I called my boss, who was Jim Ferguson at the time, commander of Systems Command, and said we had not done any tests on long range, how it would work. And I said, what I would like to do is I'd like to take off from Edwards and without refueling, but completely configured to take on bombs and whatever when I land and fly to Hawaii. And he thought about that and said, "I'll call you back." Anyhow, he called back and says, well, you can figure out the distance from Edwards to Hickam, but you're going to have to do it so that you're not over water most of that time. And it was going to be dead reckoning with the help of the onboard inertial system. So we took off from Edwards. I had tanks, just like you see here, but every other rack, every other position on the wings was ready to take bombs, and but no bombs on them, but just ready. So it was ready to land, get fuel, and get armed up, and go on a mission. So it took off from Edwards to Homestead Air Force Base. Landed there and checked with my navigation in my head, plus the inertial system. I was only 7 miles an hour after all of that.
That's amazing.
But that record, I think, on the A7 held as long as we had A7s in the active inventory. I don't know if it's ever been, but that was the longest distance. And we had not had any tests to tell what the best altitude was with that configuration for fuel consumption. But anyhow, this is a great airplane, and it was a tremendous airplane for air-ground gunnery, and with the system that it had for delivery of weapons, much better than the F-4. This little airplane was an absolute dream to fly. Without any doubt in my mind, this is the finest flight control system that was ever invented to go on a fighter. You did not need an autopilot. At 35,000 feet, you could say, okay, I'm going to make a 15-degree turn to the left, put it in a 15-degree turn, take your hands off the stick and rudders, and it just stay there. The only problem was it took a lot of runway, and it landed awfully fast. And if you didn't have a good bit of runway, you're going to run out. Another good thing about this bird, it was impossible to make a bad landing. You know why? You know what I'm doing? That is the landing gear. Instead of going like this, when you hit the ground, it did like that.
Takes out the vertical component, huh?
It took out the vertical problem completely. And it was a delight to be able to count on a grease job landing every time.
So that must have been pretty heavy wing loading.
It was, and when you didn't have power, it had the forward flying characteristics of a crew chief toolkit. It went down. I mean, you were hanging on power.
What kind of a kid was that?
You know, I've talked about the F-104, and I flew that a lot, but I haven't mentioned the NF-104, which was a rocket-boosted version of the F-104. And we had 3 of those, and they were basically designed for pilots that were headed for the space business. And they were designed to zoom using the rocket motor up to above 100,000 feet and to re-enter like a spacecraft would do. Had a 6,000-pound rocket on the tail end. It also had, on the wingtips, you had no capability of using tip tanks, but it was about a 9-inch extension on each wingtip, and it had little jets there that were controlled by a stick on the panel over here, a joystick, just like you use in a spacecraft. And it was when your flight controls were useless, which they were when you passed about 80,000 feet on your way up, you were using in the nose, there were on each side of the nose and at the top and the bottom were also these little jets that were controlled by the hand control. But as you shut off your afterburner on your rocket motor was still going. You shut off the afterburner at about 65,000 feet, and you shut off the engine at about 75,000 feet, and your rocket's still burning, and your rocket would burn out somewhere around 102, 103,000 feet. You still had a little bit to go, depending on what your alpha was. And we only had 2 kinds of alpha that were displayed in the cockpit. One was 8 degrees, one was 11 degrees. If you wanted 11 degrees, that says you might get a little higher altitude, but you might also pull a Chuck Yeager and go into an inverted flat spin and have to eject, which is what he did. But I always used the 8 degree, and I got high enough, and I got enough 0G over the top above 100,000 feet to please me at 8 degrees. Got a big dial in the center of your cockpit that came out of the X-15, and it had a horizontal reference and a vertical reference, and you just kept those 2 things lined up, and you weren't using your stick or your rudders. You used that hand control up there just like a spacecraft, because that's what it was. And
exo-atmospheric control.
Right, and if you use that to keep lined up, but you kept that 8 degree alpha, or 11 if you'd selected that, and you start out with a theta of about 45 degrees, which is angle of attack, but the real angle of attack to the wind is alpha, and you'd use theta to get start, and as if you had 8 degrees of alpha, the horizontal reference would start dropping until it got down to the center, and you were right at 8 degrees of alpha. And that's what you tried to do. You didn't try to restart your engine until you were down about 60,000 feet. But you also, at that time, you popped your speed brakes and the leading edge flaps. And you kept your engine in idle. You only had about enough fuel left for, to get you, if you rounded out, you had enough fuel to get you up to 800 or 1,000 feet to eject. That's all the fuel you had.
Oh, yeah.
But you kept the throttle in idle, and you came over the runway 270 degrees to your landing direction at 300 knots. You held 300 knots, went into a 45-degree right turn, and you kept that 45-degree turn all the way out toward Rosamond and come in, and you turned on final at about 10 or 11,000 feet above the ground. And you were doing still 300 knots. And as you approached the overrun, your gear's still up, you had the speed brakes out, leading edge flaps down, but no flaps, landing flaps. And as you started to round out, as you approached the overrun with the gear still up, and as you passed 200 knots indicated, you pulled the emergency gear extension handle and your gear popped down, hopefully. And then you, by the same time when you did that, you also hit the landing flaps. And 195 knots was max for your landing gear. And so you touched down at about 185 knots. 180 to 185 knots. So much for F-104. Tell you, I'm not an expert in the SR. I flew it a few times, but I'm not an expert. But I'll tell you about my first flight in it, which was interesting. Strangely enough, this was the first high-performance airplane that had an internal shock positioning. All the rest of them had the shock outside the inlet when you got supersonic, but here the shock was inside the inlet. And there was an automatic system that pulled this thing in and out to position the shock properly so that it hit just inside the lips. Otherwise, things were not going to go well. And you would have, what I had is on my absolute first flight, I went up north from Edwards, turned out over the Pacific, and made a 30-degree turn over Oregon, came in over Canada, and back down, still in my 30-degree bank. And I was heading for down to the Reno refueling spot, where a KC-135, which was assigned to Edwards, but it had, this thing took different fuel. It didn't take regular JP4. And I was heading for refueling on the Reno track. Well, what happened as I was descending, and my speed was going down to about 2.5 Mach number, I spit both shocks. And when that happens, the temperature goes, right up to over the red line. You have to cut the engines off and restart them. And that's what I had to do my first flight.
They call it unstart, right?
Unstart, that's what they call it, unstart. And I learned a lot on that flight. And it didn't, but what happened, when you got that, then the two unstarts were in tandem. So I didn't have to cut both off at the same time. What happened is when the first one unstarted, with a yaw that was engendered, the other one unstarted. So I had a little bit of time to start one before I had to start the other one. But what happens, you have never been in a shake like that. And I had been through that in the simulator up at Beale. They were getting their first airplanes up there, but they already had the simulator. And the simulator would give you an unstart ride. and it would just shake the living daylights out of you, and the airplane would do the same thing. But at any rate, that was my first flight. And I did get the 3.2 Mach number. And the way you do it, and the way I was briefed, was sort of like the rocket-boosted F-104. You take off to the east from Edwards, go out to the Three Sisters. You know where the Three Sisters are? Yes, sir. And you'd turn inbound to the Three Sisters, and by that time, you should have climbed up to about 38 to 40,000 feet. Drop the nose and drop down until you hit 520 knots, true airspeed. And you kept 520 knots, and you just started to climb. And that's the way it was. And you climbed and climbed and climbed and climbed. And I never gave out of the capability of climb. I'd get up to 82,000 feet. And I think, although we weren't supposed to go over 80,000 feet, at least that's the way I was briefed, by the program guy there at Edwards, I felt sure I could have climbed another 3,000 or 4,000 feet above that. But you were in full pressure suit, and it was brand new full pressure suits. And as you were in the NF-104, by the way, in full pressure suit, but they were different. These that we flew with this airplane were much, much better, and they were aluminum looking, where the one I flew in the 104 was yellow. And so, you know, you would cut a much nicer looking picture with the ones from here. Jean particularly liked this airplane, and whenever I flew it, somehow or another she had arranged to be down at the mobile control on the runway to watch me land, and I would always go up and make a couple of landings just so I could show off to her. But this thing was easy to land. You know, the B-58, which was sort of like this, it'd come in real fast, but the B-58, you were taught, and I always did, to make a double round out. You'd come in and you'd round out and you'd let it float, and then you'd round out the second time. This one, you didn't do that. You just came in and rounded it out, and it just flew into the runway as calm as anything you wanted to know.
You knew Kelly Johnson, right?
Oh, very well, very, very well.
He's the designer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kelly Johnson? Yeah, Kelly was a old friend from way back. But Kelly was also the brains, although another guy claims it, behind the F-117. Kelly was.
But he had total control of this design, didn't he? Didn't
yes, he did.
Yes,
he did. Kelly was an extremely smart aerodynamicist. And there were other younger aerodynamicists that had different ideas, but Kelly always won out. Why? Because he was head of the Skunk Works. But he was a good guy, good guy. Well, I had a few flights in that, all out at Edwards. I did fly the real long wing U-2s, all the UTCs, and it was all at Edwards. And they were based at, are you familiar with Edwards?
Yes, sir.
You know, North Base?
Yeah.
That was the U-2 at North Base. Super duper secret. But let me tell you, every flight, you had a case of beer on the line, because you told the crew chief and his assistant where they should stand on the runway. Because, you know, you had on the U-2, you can't see them there, but it had outrigger wheels that were spring-loaded, but it's just small wheels, and when you left the ground, they dropped off. But when you came back into land, you had a bicycle landing gear, and your wing would hit the ground. So what you did is you told the crew chief where he and his assistant would station themselves, so that just as your wings started to drop, they were there to catch it. And if you missed, then you had to buy for them and their cronies case beer.
Wow.
But that's true. talked about the F-4 a lot, and although it is not the most beautiful airplane in the world, it was absolutely ideal for what we used it for in Southeast Asia. Carried a lot of bombs, was a reasonable air-to-air machine, carried a lot of good air-to-air weapons, and the way this one is configured right now was pretty standard in the early part of my missions in Southeast Asia. We most always carried the drop tanks, and we always carried the AIM-7Es, 4 of them, as you can see, semi-embedded in the fuselage.
So how many missions did you fly in this airplane?
Well, I had 181 missions, and most of them were in the F-4.
This is all combat missions?
Yeah. And most of them I flew with the 8th Wing at Ubon. I had several flights with Jerry in Southeast Asia when he was head of the Fast Facts at Ubon. And he put me in on one target up in North Vietnam near Vinh. That happened to be a storage site for SA-2 missiles. There had to be 1,000 of those things there. And there were 4 of us, and we dropped all our loads of bombs on that site that Jerry put us in on. And there were secondaries going on. I've never seen secondaries like that. And I will always remember that as one of the highlights of my flying career in Southeast Asia. Although I flew a good number and with the F-4E, which was different than this is a C model, and we had the C and the D over there in Southeast Asia. But it was a good old airplane, let me tell you that. The F-16 was a nice airplane, but compared to the F-15, it was ho-hum. The cockpit on the F-15 was designed by fighter pilots. I like to think I had a little bit of input to that, but as you said, the guy that really had the most was the program manager.
The F-15 seemed to be like the chance for the Air Force to really build an airplane that they had all the features they wanted after the tail end of the Vietnam War. I guess it must have started in the early 70s, right? Thereabouts.
Well, one of the things that I like to say that was the reason that the F-15 turned out as well as it did is that pilots designed the cockpit. That's a fact. That is the only fighter that I know about that happened. But
well, you know, my put on that is, it was also because of Ben Bellis,
well, Ben,
who was a missile guy.
You're absolutely. Ben Bellis was an ideal program manager.
Right.
The reason was, and he aggravated me sometimes, but the reason he was such a good program manager is he did what Ben Bellis wanted to do, what he thought was right, and he didn't let anybody talk him into anything. That was Ben's trademark, and it worked, let me tell you. I don't know of a program manager that did a better job of managing his program than Ben Bellis did on the F-15. Even though sometimes I told Ben to do something and he did something else. He was always right if it had something to do with the F-15.
He was experienced.
He was.
He even had his own squash court here at the old right field. When I was in the B-1, he was his F-15 squadron built their own squash court down here in right field. Yeah, yeah.
Well, Ben was a one-off, I'll tell you. But he did take maximum use of fighter pilots in designing the F-15 cockpit. Today, even though it's been, God knows, 1981 since I flew the F-15. The day before I retired, I could shut my eyes and sit in the F-15 cockpit. I know where everything is. It's right where it ought to be. F-16, who knows? You have to look and search for the damn gauges and switches you want. Another thing I didn't take care for about the F-16, it was somebody got the idea of a side stick. And I know that you guys who are lovers of the French system like that side stick control on the airplanes that they make, the airliners. And I guess it works, but I never really liked the side stick on a fighter. Another thing.
You're talking about the location of it or the
location
sensitivity of it? Didn't it also have a different response mode?
Well, the first time I flew it was out at Edwards, and I was Commander of Systems Command. And I went out and flew it. It was one of the test airplanes. And I came down and I wallowed all over. It was so sensitive that you had trouble holding it. And I got down and I talked to the test pilot that we had there, the main test pilot. I said, he said, I have that problem every time. And I asked him, had he written it up? Yeah. And so I asked the program manager, I forget who it was. It was
Jim Abramson?
Jim Abramson.
Yeah, yeah.
Why the hell he hadn't fixed that? And so he said, well, nobody ever explained it to me like that. So they got busy because the boss had been up and had complained about the touchiness of the stick, and they fixed it. And it was so simple to fix. All they did was reduce the sensitivity because it was all electronic, and there was absolutely no mechanical connection between that stick and anything, nothing.
Well, wasn't it pressure? You didn't have to displace, but just put pressure and.
That's right. No, another thing I got them to do, when I first flew it, there was zero movement in the stick. That was off-putting for me. And I said, look, even if it's only 1/8 of an inch, have a little play in the stick. And they did that, and after they changed the system to be less sensitive, and they changed it to put that little bit of play in the side stick. Hell, I didn't have any problem at all. But I take credit for that.
There you go.
Well, as I say, this is one of my 3 favorite airplanes of all the airplanes I've flown. Is the P-51, the F-86, hard wing F, and this airplane. If I had to select one, I'd probably select this one. Because this airplane I always felt totally comfortable in. And I flew it a lot, and I flew it all the way, the single seat version, which is this is, it's A, all the way up to the day before I retired. The day before I retired, I went out with Bobby Bond, who was commander of the armament development business down at Ejection, and he took a F-16, and I took an old F-15A, which is that's what this is.
Yeah.
But the one that I flew they hadn't cleaned out the cockpit in 6 months. I mean, it was grungy. Anyhow, we went out over the ocean and had a dogfight, and we came back, and as far as I was concerned, I won, and as far as he was concerned, he won. But really a nice airplane. It was totally pilot friendly. The cockpit, as I've already said, was totally pilot friendly. And as I say, I could get up there right now and start this thing up, and with my eyes shut, know exactly where every switch was. And I can't talk about that like that in any other airplane except the 86F. But this one had a lot of switches in there, but everything was exactly where it should be, and it was again designed by pilots. But you mentioned the double flame out. it was, again, I was taking off from Dallas, Fort Worth in a A model, heading for a classified location up northeast of Edwards. On the F-100 engine, quite often, you would have a big belch and your temperature would go out of sight. Well, I had that on my right engine. I pulled it off, and by the way, I had a full load of fuel since I was going a long ways. I had 3 600-gallon tanks on the bottom of my airplane, so I was heavy. And Dallas-Fort Worth, taking off, you're taking off right over Dallas, South Dallas. And our ceiling was about 700 or 800 feet. So I had this burp problem, and the temperature on the right engine started to go out of sight, so I shut that one off. Then the same thing happened on the left engine, very much like the problem I told you with the unstart on the SR. But it was an easy restart. So I got the right one spinning up again while I'd shut off the left one, and I finally got both of them started, and neither one of them overheated. Both of them got up to a little bit over the red line. And what I was worried about is I was so heavy, and I was heading out over the suburbs of South Dallas, I couldn't drop the tanks. So I had to stay down under the clouds, which I did, and I turned back thinking I was going to land back at Navy Dallas, and everything was looking fine. And I said, well, to hell with it, I'm going on my mission. So I continued on. My engine seemed to be doing okay, and I went to the place I was headed for, which I think is still classified, I'm not sure. But I landed there, and I had phone calls from everybody. I was a 4-star at the time, and I had a call from the chief staff, from the program manager, from the CEO of Pratt & Whitney. You know, all of them, what in the world happened? And so I told the guys that met me there, you haven't seen me. So I did my business there and took off and flew on back to Edwards. By the time I got to Edwards, there was half dozen people that had come out to read me the riot act, I guess, because I should have landed back at, and I said, well, look at the engine, see if there's anything damaged to it. There wasn't any damage to it. So I dodged a bullet there. I should have landed back at Dallas, but in order to do that, I would have had to dump those 3 tanks of fuel, 600-gallon tanks. And I didn't want to do that. So anyhow. Well, that obviously wasn't in the Korean War.
Yeah.
We spent several years, Al and I, working on that airplane.
It's amazing they have that in the museum now.
Yeah.
It just got around to flying its combat.
Operational, yeah.
Yeah.
We watched it have its first flight, and we had spent off and on 7 years working on that airplane.
I worked with you for several years when you did, even after the Air Force consultation to these aircraft builders. The F-22, we had a big hand in the F-22.
Well, we worked for them for several years.
Kind of interesting to think about what your comment would be on the effect of all your years flying, as well as the combat leadership experience, in terms of how that would add value to the new development of a modern fighter like the F-22.
Well, I think we added, and you were part of that, and our group that was working with Lockheed as sort of in a quasi-engineering capacity, and then another capacity as an inspector general capacity to tell them what they were doing wrong and how they could do it better. I think we added a hell of a lot. I don't know if you remember or not, but the first version of the F-22, out of 7 entrants, it was by far the worst. But that was, they didn't, that was not, that was just a preliminary look of the Air Force. But they had what they were trying to do. They were trying to make a Mach 2.5 version of the F-117. If you remember, it was a disaster. The first time we went in to that theater, and the chairman of Lockheed plus all his senior people were there, and on the way out, when they briefed us on that, before we did anything, that was one of the first things they did. He said, "Al, what do you think?" And I said, "That will not fly. And unless you can do a whole lot better than that, save your money." And to save you some money, I will get my troops and we will go back home, because there is nothing that we can do to help that particular system that you're going to present.
Well, you were big on telling them not only what was wrong, but how to fix it. So I guess you gave them some clues as to where to go.
I did.
Yeah.
And by the way, you remember, and I tell people this, they say, "Oh, you couldn't have done that." I said, ground rule number one for anybody that joined the SEI team, my team, Slay Enterprises, Inc., was that you have absolutely zero contact with anybody in the military or the Department of Defense.
Right.
And that was an absolute golden rule, the number one rule we had.
No calls to the Pentagon, no
calls,
visits
no
there. The focus was on...
And no using of any information that you picked up, even casually, from the Pentagon. It had to be what we got from their engineers and from looking and talking
How
to
to
their
make it
people.
better. Yeah.
I have enjoyed every minute of my Air Force life. I spent almost 39 years in the Air Force. And I started out as a private and worked up to my final rank. But I never had a job that I didn't like. I never flew an airplane I didn't like. I had a lot of them that were my favorites. My first favorite was the P-51. Second, the F-86F, Hard Wing F. And my favorite of all was the F-15.